Okay.
Unhide the splash screen.
Technical difficulties.
There we go.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Hi, I'm Katie Wood.
I'm John Bearden.
And today we're going to be talking about game design with John, specifically about things he's worked on in VR and a little bit maybe about our most recent VR project, Island Time VR. But we're just going to go ahead and kind of jump right into it. So.
Cool. Well, like I said, I'm John Bearden. I'm the game designer here at Flight School. And so from our splash screen here, a little bit of my background.
A little tricky.
I've been in the game industry for probably over 13 years now, and I've worked on such titles as Ghostbusters, the video game, Star Wars Connect, which we kind of have playing back here in the background, and then also Tug, the Untitled game. And so everyone will get to enjoy some fun Star Wars dancing, since that was one of the titles I worked on.
Star Wars shuffle going on. I remember playing this. I had this. I got a special R2-D2 Xbox 360, and it came with this. It was bundled. So
I remember that one. That was actually one of our promos things, was to have that as...
Yeah, I loved it because it came with, like, if I pressed the start button for the R2-D2, it would beep, 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 on, and beep, 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 off. And then it came with the gold C-3PO controller, too.
Okay.
So I felt super cool.
Yeah, I think we actually had some unlockable content with some of that, too. Like, we were supposed to have C-3PO as being an unlockable content as part of the dancing mode and things like that. And we had other characters throughout the things. So.
Oh, cool. So
not just dance mode. We actually had other modes, although, you know, I'm preferencing this one because I worked on it. So,
So walk me through a little bit about it. Is it... like the kind of the start concept phase of it, was it always going to be dancing?
So yeah, we always kind of wanted to have a dancing mode to it, and actually this is a good segue because I guess you could call Connect kind of that learning steps for getting into VR and things like that.
Totally.
But they always wanted to have a dancing element to it. This was definitely one that we pushed on. We had a lot of other designs throughout the project that kind of went out there. The final version ended up having dance, a Jedi version. We had Jedi battles, a starfighter, and then also a Rancor and a pod racing version. And I think I ended up touching every one of those at some point in time, but this was kind of the one that I was lead designer on.
Very cool. So you had to kind of take into consideration player movement, kind of the 360 movement, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
Camera and everything.
Yeah, so dance turned out to be a little bit easier than a lot of the other Connect, because when we were working on this one, Connect had just launched, so we didn't have a lot of other games to kind of pull from and learn that. So we were basically R&Ding the tech while we were building these games. And so dance was a little bit easier because it was kind of you watch the character and then you perform back to that, and we're basically judging your gestures based off of that. Some of the other ones like Jedi got into a little bit more of the complication because we wanted that more one-for-one sort of thing. So of course Connect is basically mapping your body and trying to track that data live. And the problem with that is you don't want a Jedi to look funny or do rude moves or just look broken in general. And so a lot with that, we actually had to do some mapping with animations to blend on top of the characters or the player's movement. So that was a lot trickier to kind of solve that. And this was also very early on with tech, so even simple things like just holding a lightsaber was very difficult just because we didn't have that sort of fine-tuned tracking on like the wrists and things like that.
Brandon Oldenburg wrote in and commented, he wants to know, can C-3PO do the robot, or in this case, the droid?
So we did have a lot of custom dance moves for them. And so, like that, we had, I think that was in the Death Star version, we had a lot of Daft Punk sort of elements to it. And in fact, we had a Daft Punk cover that we had for that one. And so there were a lot of kind of robot maneuvers in that one that... Darth Vader and the Emperor would dance to. But then also with Han Solo had his own level as well, so he had some kind of blaster maneuvers and things like that. But we had a whole custom dance routine for each one of the characters in the stages.
I'd imagine you just kind of, with the philosophy for this, just to have fun with it, like kind of goofy. I like that the lyrics are kind of transformed into the Star Wars lyrics of popular songs. Did you guys just try to kind of pun it up and go the extra mile with it? Or
we kind of had a mix of that. So we had certain songs that we kept exactly like the song. And then others that we had a little bit of a cover band thing too. And so one of them for the Death Star version was we changed YMCA to Empire Today. And I was actually, I got to do chorus singing on that one. So a lot of the developers went in and we did the chorus for Empire Today. So I also got to sing on this one as well as dance.
Hey, there we go. That's awesome. I remember that I'm a princess in a, what was it?
Princess in a Bottle.
Princess in a Bottle, but it was Princess in a Bottle, I guess.
I think Princess in a Bottle was the original name, and then we changed it to Princess in a Battle for
that's
Leia.
what it was. Genie, I'm a genie in a bottle.
Genie in a bottle, and then
it was Princess in a Battle, and I remember my 90s girl was like, all right, I appreciate a little bit of this. This is nice. So did you have to, I guess you guys were QAing all the time and working, did you work with choreographers and stuff at all?
Yeah, so we had a couple of dancers that we went out and filmed, and then took that basically that whole dance routine and then brought it back over and brought it onto our characters and kind of tweaked it a little bit to make it work within the game world. But pretty much what you're seeing with like Boba Fett here and the Stormtroopers, those are actually choreographed from a male and female dancer depending on which character model they were mapped to.
Sweet. Awesome. Yeah, so did you guys have to cut down the amount of songs or at any point?
Yeah, we had a lot more songs that we originally were pitching on this and also other levels as well. And so through the process of any sort of game thing, you start getting closer to the end of things. You have to start figuring out how to cut things and what's actually approved and elements like that went into consideration. And so another thing that was, we had like, I can't remember how many songs we had approved altogether, but we definitely had other dance routines we could have put in there. But like one of the elements that got kind of cut out of this just because we didn't have the time, we had a really nice camera system that would actually fly around the player and take pictures at certain points. So it'd capture you doing the lasso thing or doing the blaster, and then you'd have that kind of basically a takeaway of a capture of you doing something silly during that moment. But we had to take that out just for time considerations and running into some tech issues and things like that. But that way we made sure to go ahead and deliver on time and get all the dance elements in there and give a full player experience without cheating ourselves on anything, trying to get in tech that just wasn't ready.
Yeah. Was it, I guess when it was announced to you guys you were going to be working on a Star Wars game, did you know or think it would be a dance game at all? Or
So part of that, like I said, we had a lot of pitches that never quite made it there. These kind of 4 or 5 modes that actually did make it there were ones that we had to get into the game. Okay. And so there was a lot of iteration of like, what is Star Wars in this kind of motion sensing thing? So when we first started approaching it, we're looking at other sort of motion controller systems, like the Wii was out at that point in time, as well as PlayStation started working on some of their Move stuff, but hadn't actually quite got it out. But what is compelling to basically being able to track motion within the gameplay experience? And so we had a lot of ideas that were party game-esque. Like the original pod racing was a lot more Mario Kart than what it turned out to be, which is a little bit closer to like Forza. And so there was a lot of ideas like, let's make everything party feeling, because that's what motion control kind of feels like right now. It's these little quick elements that you can capture fun things, and it's fun but not deep. But what we were looking at with this, since it is Star Wars, we didn't want to just have a Star Wars party game. We wanted to have a more deeper element. At the same point in time, Force Unleashed 2 had come out. So we were looking at how do we make Force Unleashed 2 in motion control. So it was a little bit of a lofty goal, especially since we were working on new tech that hadn't really had a lot of proving out on what was capable and not capable with it. So there was a lot of planning of getting elements that would work, and then just requirements that we ran into, especially with like Jedi. We had a version of Jedi that was more like the Wii sword game, to where you just saw the player's hands and the saber in the hand, which was really great for tracking, but it didn't give that ownership of you feeling like the character. You couldn't see yourself as a Jedi. You didn't feel like a Jedi so much, because it turned into more of a first-person shooter. And so that's when we kind of moved of, well, this works really good, but we need to make it work better in this third-person perspective so the player can feel more like the Jedi and see themselves as the Jedi, rather than just having a first-person sword game.
Very cool. Very cool. So was this one of your first game projects you worked on, or just one of the first big ones you had a hand in?
This is probably the second one I'd worked on. Okay. The first one I'd worked on at TRI was Ghostbusters, the video game.
Oh, okay.
And so that was pretty much a project that was, I think it was born on the idea of this, basically Ghostbusters was a franchise that's very popular, but there's not a lot of high-end games out there. And then later on, it kind of got a little bit more of a push from Sony because they had started switching over into wanting to get their refresh a lot of their IP. And so they're looking at possibility of doing another Ghostbusters movie and recasting all that, which eventually did happen. But it was that same sort of push of Sony kind of pushed the project a little bit more, wanting to get more treadway out of it and to kind of refresh some of their IPs. But it was a really fun project to work on as well, and that was probably my first project in the game industry, and I think it still turned out really well. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to find nowadays because of basically the license and who owns the product and things like that, but you can definitely find some videos out there, and a lot of people, well, not to put down the movie that did come out, but a lot of people end up calling that one the Ghostbusters 3 movie that never happened.
I gotcha. So after Star Wars Connect, you've already dealt with sort of the tracking, motion sensing stuff. Is this when you started switching over to VR development, or had you done other games in between?
I took a little bit of a break after that. I wanted to do indie development. Like, both of those projects were very large projects working on big teams, which that's a whole other experience versus doing an indie, because you tend to have a lot more, I guess, working within teams. So a lot of people, a lot of hands touching things. You can't really have ownership so much on things. And I wanted to bring it down to a little bit. So I went into indie development, and that's when I found myself working for Nerd Kingdom and working on Tug, the Untitled game.
Very cool. So can you tell me a little bit about Tug?
Sure. Yeah. So Tug came about at the time that a lot of people were looking at trying to make that Minecraft 2. They wanted to Minecraft had kind of taken off. It was a huge success, but everyone wanted to improve upon it. And where do we go from there with Minecraft? And so that was joining up with a lot of academics that wanted to build basically a game from the ground up that had a data analytics in it, could build data modeling, and they could gather a lot of information about players, which people had already kind of been doing through Minecraft communities and custom builds of Minecraft. We just wanted to be able to run that from the ground up, so we'd have a lot more of that information and do a lot more with that data modeling. So Tug went through the whole Kickstarter process. We got a version of it out there that was very close to a Minecraft feel. It was a procedural generated world with smooth terrain and a lot of gameplay elements to it. But then we kind of wanted to expand upon that and improve the tech, and it turned into a little bit more of an RD thing that just kind of put it into the pipeline of having to redevelop a lot of the engine and a lot of the original code. And so I think that's still kind of where Tug is right now. They're trying to figure out where they are with the R&D part of it and figure out what game they're actually going to pull out of that sort of thing.
So you've got kind of a wide variety of games under your belt.
Yeah, and I guess different fields as well. The traditional kind of action adventure, and then going into motion sensing, and then the kind of more visceral experience, and then going into procedural design and data analytics and things like that. And now that brings me into VR.
Just the journey of John we're going on here today. So what was any VR project you want to do? Do we want to start talking about VR projects here, or do you want to talk about some examples of good gameplay or gameplay? I
think just getting into VR is I mean, there's a little bit of a background with the motion controls and things like that, which leads a little bit into VR, but VR now puts the player into kind of a new perspective. Basically, what has changed from just motion control, the Wii controller, or whether it's the Kinect sensor that's in front of you. Now we're removing that other element, which is your environment around you. We're taking that away and forcing you more into the game with VR. So there's a lot of kind of different design concerns when you do that to the player. You're now presenting a screen that they may not necessarily have that sort of control over like they do when it's a little bit removed from the motion sensing and things like that.
Okay, yeah. So you got some examples we're going to maybe look at?
Yeah, so I was getting into VR. Of course, I still think VR is still kind of at that new stages. We see a lot of VR games that are basically taking something existing property and then turning it into a VR concept rather than taking a game from the ground up. And so something like Rez, which is what we're showing right now, is one of those properties of where it was a fantastic game, very visual, very exciting, a lot of playing with sound and motion and things like that. And so their approach to basically taking it into VR is, what do we do that's, taking this already good game concept, but now we add this VR layer to it of putting the screen closer in front of the player, adding in some motion sensing and things like that the original game didn't have. And so a lot of what you're seeing in their design is, how do we solve this issue, a little bit of the disconnect with the controller. This kind of happens with motion controllers definitely, which is players don't have as much control over the analog joystick or the button mapping and things like that. So how do you kind of still give the players an interesting and fulfilling experience, but having them a little bit removed from what they're used to with that very tight controls that you'll find in gamepad sort of design. So with this one, what they're kind of trying to approach it with is still give you, they're trying to key on what were the important aspects of Res, which was that visual appeal, the sound, the design on that, and then how do we still make the gameplay part, the actual part you used to do with the controller, still fun with this idea of keeping it in the VR space. And so a lot of what you're seeing on here is that idea of, okay, well, so targeting is going to be an issue. You're going to have problems with basically the player being able to target certain things because they don't have as much fidelity with the joysticks and things like that. So now we're moved to more of a motion controller, but how do we still get that sort of fun feel? And I think they kind of grabbed a good essence of it in this version of their conversion of the game itself.
So this is a game that wasn't originally designed for VR, but was sort of overhauled later to be retrofitted for VR.
Yeah, and you'll find a lot of them. The big titles seem to just be traveling that same route of basically taking, what's an existing property that's interesting and people enjoy, and how do we then turn around and make that into a VR experience? And so, I mean, another kind of example of that is the Batman one. So the Arkham games are really great, but it's an action-adventure game, and there's a lot of precision control on there that the player needs in order to get into fighting situations and things like that. So this sort of approach is taking that property that's already an interesting property, and then how do we make it more of a VR experience versus the kind of beat 'em up that it was before. And so in here, they're doing a great job of basically giving more ownership to the avatar. A lot of VR ends up being the floating hands or the device that you're holding and things like that, but that's, that kind of removes the avatar, which players like to associate with. Kind of going back to the Star Wars Jedi sort of field, where, if we just have a lightsaber and a hand in front of us, that's not nearly as compelling as seeing myself in the body of a Jedi. And so some of the examples in this is that they kind of have that removed aspect that you'll find in a lot of VR, which is just the hands or the tools that I'm using. But there's moments within the Batman experience of where you get to see yourself in the Batman suit and I feel more like Batman, or I'm meeting with characters that ground me in the experience that I am Batman and not just basically floating tools in space.
Yeah, that is something of, you only really have the hands of the character in VR right now, and so only seeing that can sort of be a little bit of disconnect if you're playing a role or sort of have to be a person or a character.
Yeah, and there are a lot of elements in design when you're thinking about things. I mean, obviously, controls are important. You want good game mechanics. You want the player to feel like they're not fighting the system, basically. So controls are huge in design. The other aspects of that are basically any sort of game mechanics the player is interacting with. So I have good controls, but now is it compelling for the user experience? Am I doing fun things with these game mechanics? And then kind of the avatar is that other example of that, which is what is it that's taking me out of the experience? What makes it not me anymore, but a hero or something that I'm becoming, a fantasy that I'm trying to live out? And so Avatar is one of those things where you wouldn't think of it so much in design. It feels like it's more of a kind of an artistic feel of making it just a pretty sort of model to be. But in design, it's hugely important to make sure that, if you're Drake from Uncharted, you feel like Drake. You don't feel like suddenly you're Roger Rabbit and stumbling around and being cartoony, because that takes you out of the experience of feeling like this superhero buff character who can climb mountains and find treasure and be Indiana Jones.
I see. Exactly. I could see that being sort of a weird juxtaposition. There we go. Good grief. Anyway, between avatar versus environment, for sure.
Yeah. So linking that back into VR, I think that's kind of one of the next things to kind of think about with the design in VR is how do we make sure to keep the idea of avatar and that experience of putting me into that role. And I think that's a challenge going forward with VR and design itself, is because we're right now we're fighting with the idea of the tools in the hands and the experience being that visual, the setting kind of setting you within the idea that you're this hero or this amazing character, but without actually seeing those elements.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. So I actually have never played this Batman game. But is it you're just Batman? You're doing certain training tasks? Is
and
that it?
There's a little bit of kind of detective work later on with it as well. And this kind of leads into another kind of example or design challenge with VR, which is how does the player move around the environment? So
right, yeah.
We've got in VR we tend to have a couple of things you can do in VR, which is you can teleport around or you can move the joystick. And so both of those are the teleport is probably the easiest example that gets players through an environment, but also makes it to where they're not going to feel sick. Yeah. The actual moving through the joystick and things like that tends to kind of hit a lot of motion sickness with players, and so that will definitely bring you out of the experience if you're wanting to do that. Yeah. So with the Batman example, they do a lot of use of the bat hook or the bat grapple to move you through those experiences. And so that definitely ties within the character where it feels like, oh, I'm Batman because I'm using the bat grapple to move to these places. But it breaks a little bit of it too, especially if you're doing the detective work and it's in an office space and you're bat grappling back and forth between the areas. So that's where a little bit of like
he
taking
can't
that
walk.
Yeah. Yes.
The highly active Batman can't walk.
He's very lazy Batman. And so that's where you start breaking down the sort of thing again of now you've broken me out of that experience. You've turned me into the cartoony thing of like I'm no longer feeling like Batman if I'm just lazily dragging myself from one office desk to the next. Yeah. And so that's kind of one of those approaches to where they found a travel mechanic that works, which is the teleport, and they've added some layer to it to make it feel like that's the way it should work. But then it breaks a little bit because it wasn't thought through all the way of like traversing the terrain or traversing the environment. Kind of a fix for that would have been basically making it to where Batman is never on the ground, which sounds weird because now he's Spider-Man. But essentially, if Batman is always going from rooftop to rooftop and the experience of the rooftops themselves being kind of a singular, I have elements that I do when I'm on that rooftop, whether it's interrogating someone by dropping them over the side of the building or I'm solving some crime within a small area on top of that rooftop, and then I travel by bat hook to the next one, then that doesn't take me out of the experience of feeling like Batman. It still fits me within the context of the story of Batman, and it also solves the issue of getting to that goofiness factor that happens a lot of times when we're trying to fix things in VR design.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting to think about too in a way, because the motion VR, you were really active. You were encouraged to move around with every part of your body, and now VR, which is still relying on camera motion detection in some respects, you're limited though. Yeah. You can't move that way because running and walking, even with motion control stuff, it was restrictive.
But yeah, I mean, it is very interesting to think about that because even with motion control, the one element we only removed from that is just the idea that now the screen is right in front of you and we block off the rest of the room. So with motion control, we kind of allowed the player to figure out what it is that they are allowed to basically figure out their own danger spots because they can still see that world that they exist in, even though they're using motion control to control their avatar within the game. So it's relying on the player to basically being able to make sure they're not going to bump into the sofa or run into somebody or hit the TV. But once you put that VR screen in front of you, we've further immersed you in the world, which is awesome. But then we've taken away that kind of ability to protect yourself. So you're immersed in our world, but our world doesn't set the context of here are the safety zones for you. Here's when you're going to fall off a cliff. Here's when you're going to run into somebody. We've removed that element from it. So it's definitely a weird kind of disconnect of it from motion control to VR. And I think a lot of what happened is there hasn't been a real further investigation of what it is it exactly that we keep the player within that space but still have them enjoy the experience and feel like they're immersed in the world without tripping over the sofa.
Right, which is something with kind of Island Time VR, plug. We tried to work around a bit with having an island. So you're already sort of kind of understand your boundaries because you're stuck.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example to kind of tie in with what we were just talking about, which is taking the Batman experience of keeping you to confined spaces for your interactive moments, and then your travel is totally just getting you to another one of those confined spaces. And I think Island Time does that very well, to where I have a lot of things that I do on the island, and there's a lot of activities, but I'm on the island. I'm not then turning around and then swimming across the water and things like that we would expect you to then have to traverse in your own living room space to swim to the next island or swim out to the boat or things like that. There's still the idea, there's a lot of fun things and a lot of elements to it, and you're still within the notion of being a survivor on a small island. And you don't have to basically further constrain the player by any sort of other extra means.
Right, yeah, and it's still kind of an interesting process and a work in progress type thing for the industry of seeing all the creative ways they get around that restriction. Now we have controllers, which just a few years ago we did not, and so now we have that, so we can grab things and interact. So we're a step further, but now it's like, okay, how do we work within? You can grab things, but you can only walk about like 4 feet away. So how do you do that? And teleporting can be a semi-solve for sure. But
yeah, I know the industry always goes back and forth on the teleporting thing, and I guess I'm one of those idealists that still thinks we can find somehow in design to kind of solve the problem of having to use a crutch of teleporting you around through places. The other aspect of that is if you do use teleport for your transportation, take the example of like Batman or something like that, to where give reason why you're able to move so fast through the environment. Is it a tool that you're using? Are you the Flash? Can you move really fast? And pull that into your gameplay. So it's more of making sure that if you have constraints that you know about, make sure that you're working within those constraints enough that it's not just throwing something on because everyone kind of solves it that way and there is no better way of solving the issue.
That's true.
So on that same sort of note, just talking about moving through the environment, Echo Arena kind of pulls in the idea of putting you in an Ender's game with a little bit of Quidditch mixed in and things like that. But I love how they've solved the issue of how the player moves around through the environment. Now, this solve is definitely going to bring on a little bit of that motion sickness again, because now the player is moving independent of them actually moving their physical body. But just within this environment, there's so many good things that they've kind of dealt with as far as those design concerns. I'm now in a 0G sort of environment. I'm pushing myself around through different areas. So it fits all the context of the experience of being in this outer space game room, basically, and the reason why I'm floating around. And then they've also solved that issue of like, what does my avatar look like? So instead of worrying about making my avatar look like an actual human being and matches up to my proportions and things like that, they've gone the route of making kind of this robot sort of AI that you're moving around in the environment. So any sort of wacky things that happens, it's based off of that robot more so than like your character going and doing stupid things.
We have a couple questions real fast.
Sure.
One is from Hey Saratoga, who's Sarah.
Okay.
Do you think we're getting enough haptic feedback from VR controllers? Is there anything about the actual controllers that could be better for game designers?
So I think that's kind of partly the next steps for this. I mean, the dream of VR is always that haptic feedback and getting the full bodysuit that you jump into and can give you all sorts of sensations and feelings from the game feedback and things like that. I think we're getting close to that technology, but that's moving into a tech that is unknown at this point in time. We don't know when that's going to arrive, and we'll be able to have that and our flying cars, but hopefully we will get there eventually. But yeah, as far as haptic feedback on what we have currently, which is basically kind of a controller system that's in your hands, there's definitely a lot of just simple vibrations sell a lot. And you wouldn't think it of just putting on the headset itself and then suddenly removing the idea that there's a floor beneath me, or in the example of Echo Arena, that I'm in this giant cavern. Just that itself, that visual feedback is enough to kind of fool the player's brain and make them feel like they're more in the environment without even being moved off the floor or having some rumble pad or putting them in some floating device to kind of further feel that. There's a lot that just tricking the brain through just simple illusions, visual illusions, tends to be enough for a lot of players. And so pushing more for like haptic feedback and controllers and things like that, I think we're at the level right now to where we have enough of those tools to basically provide really good game experiences. And it's kind of one of those, I think we wait and see where the tech goes, and if we get our haptic suits that we can just crawl inside of and also don't turn stinky because we can't wash them. Yeah. When we get to that stage, then we'll see some amazing design changes and a paradigm shift in how games are made.
I will say grabbing right now, too, even just for the controllers as they are, you have to kind of hold down a button, and by holding down, you're essentially grabbing, you're making a similar motion.
Yeah.
And so you're sort of understanding it kind of still connects. It's
Yeah.
not the exact
Yeah.
same, and it's not amazingly as like maybe a haptic glove would be, but
Yeah.
but it's still pretty good.
And it kind of fits within sort of a design paradigm as well, which is how many layers of complexity do you add to the player whenever you're designing a mechanic for them to use. So taking basically, so traditional gaming, even think of it like hardware as like a design level basically. So getting a controller into a player's hands who has never used a controller whatsoever or ever played. Modern controllers are filled with buttons and filled with tons of things to hit and touch, and you have no feedback on what they do. So consider that one layer of difficulty basically for the uninitiated gamer. But take someone who's played games for a while and knows pretty much the control scheme. They can pretty much pick up any controller that has buttons on it and analog sticks and be able to go from there. So that's only one layer of complexity. But with like VR, we're taking away now your space within the world. We put you into the game itself, which is now, and we've also handed you a controller. So now we're up to 2 layers at that point in time, maybe almost 3. And so depending on the number of layers of complexity that you add to the design, that's kind of how, when you start having the drop off from basically what level of player can enjoy your experience, and where do you start having that issue of just putting up such a tall gateway that people can enjoy your game at that point in time.
Yeah, that's true. And then we have another question from Brandon Oldenburg again. What are you most excited about concerning the future of VR?
So I'm really actually excited about the idea of how VR can basically help real world situations. And so, I mean, I guess that's always been on the back burner for game design and games in general, is like how do we make people better? How do we basically improve people's lives, and how do we use this technology to solve problems that we haven't been able to solve? And so I think VR is getting much closer than the traditional sort of game thing, because once again it's that layer sort of thing. Once we remove the idea that you're in front of a screen and you're touching a keyboard or a mouse or a joystick, and now you're just immersed in a world, there's so much, we've removed so many layers of complexity that we can get more personal with people. So the idea of like a lot of things that are out there, like VR chat, it's kind of a fun little thing. You can go in, you can create your avatar, and you can talk with other people online. It's very similar to like old school chat things, but what's unique about that is now we've given you an avatar that's not just a removed on a computer screen, it's actually in front of you. So you can start making a little bit more of those human connections of, this feels closer to an actual person now, rather than knowing that there's these layers of, I log into a website and then I get on my chat system and I have some emotional things that I can share with them, like emojis and things like that, but that doesn't really sell that sort of level of humanity that you get from like just looking at facial features or an actual full body and hands and doing motions through that. So I think VR, that's what I'm really excited with VR is how close we can get to real human interaction once again in video games, rather than having these layers that kind of remove that sort of element.
Yeah, I would ditto that. Second that. It'll be kind of interesting. I haven't really thought too much about it. I kind of just go with the flow in terms of technology, I guess. Yeah. But I don't know, just the idea of someone who maybe couldn't walk or couldn't do something physically restrictive, it would be, I think, very cool for them to dive into a VR headset and suddenly be able to be Batman or something, you know, and that's amazing, I would think, to be able to, and also connect with people all around the world. You know, that's another great thing. All about these human aspects, I guess, that we could do with VR.
So what we're showing right now is actually one that I was kind of fascinated in, that I found out about just recently, which is oncology wards are actually reaching out for VR developers to develop projects that allow these kids who are kind of trapped in going through this horrible process of testing and medical and everything else to now enjoy experiences that they may be restricted from going and doing. And so this is one of those examples of just basically people who have not lived certain world experiences now being able to use a device, not just log into a computer and watch a video, but now it's right in front of them. They're getting to enjoy, basically almost enjoy that experience in real life, but through this medium that we have. this very powerful tool that we have.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, and it feels, if you've ever been in a VR headset before, it feels like it's right there. And so that's a fantastic use of it. I feel like, puppies and everything. That's I'm all about more puppy tech, but yeah, that's great. That's exactly what the industry has a bit of a leg up on just traditional video game mediums of 2D or more flat ways of interacting in this kind of technology. The virtual reality is distinctly unique in when it can do things like that.
Yeah,
I feel like that's really where it gets some of its kind of pizzazz a little bit.
Then we'll lead right into Doom.
Yeah, but then there's some other aspects that are just awesome. So Doom is, Doom's been around forever in the video game industry, but Doom VR is taking it a little bit differently here.
Yeah, so this one I kind of wanted to show, kind of going back to the how to solve that issue of moving the player around. I mean, Doom is obviously a high, fast-paced sort of movement, and so you want to have positioning in it. I mean, any sort of first-person shooter, you want to have positioning, but of like Doom and Quake and Unreal, all those are like high-action sort of positioning. It's not Call of Duty of where you're trying to find a location to hide and strike from and things like that. This Doom is very in your face. And so just on this one, I mean, this was taking one of those experiences that, Doom's been around forever. They didn't change Doom. They didn't go back and remake the whole game of Doom to make it interesting, but they did solve the issue of, okay, how do we move the player around? And so going to the teleport mechanic, which, that's kind of like, why teleport? But it feels good in this one because it makes that sense of, you're just traversing the arena really fast. I mean, it's the same thing as if you were doing a jump pad in Unreal or in Quake or something like that. And that gives context within this sort of experience because they didn't have to change Doom and they didn't have to add something into Doom that was new and different to that whole context. It still feels like there's these jump pads that you're getting on to get around to different locations.
Yeah, it's interesting why it works so well here, kind of comparatively, but it does, as I'm just watching the video, feel much more kind of cool in a way, like you're kind of pulling your enemy towards you and then firing a shot, and then it's much more almost like a weapon to be used instead of a restriction.
Okay, yeah. So I'll turn question for you. Question for you. I've been talking so much. What are you most excited about in VR?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I just enjoy kind of the immersiveness of it. That's something that has been very fascinating to a lot of first-time users, and even myself as a repeat user, of just being able to really see all around you at any time. But gosh, I think just the more varied experiences we get, maybe the more free range of motion we get in the future, with like moving your legs or something to be able to actually walk. I think once we hit that would just open up so many more doors, and I don't know. Yeah, just like I guess something like that.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where we have our VR room that we go into, a special room with just all your hookups to move around in the space?
We're in the baby steps towards that, I guess. It's so hard to know how long that will take, or if some great wrench gets hit in the system of like, no, you're kind of stagnated at this point for a while tech-wise.
Yeah.
But people are coming out with new versions all the time. All these different companies are super interested in AR, VR. So it's promising for sure, but I could see it in a way. I could see our game rooms being rooms that are VR rooms, or telephone booths not being telephone booths. They're like virtual reality call center areas where you VR chat in them instead of going in and making a phone call, and just gets more and more incorporated into our daily lives.
I think you're right. I think it's one of those bubbling up technology things. So like somebody's going to end up figuring out kind of the perfect solution for what do you have for your track device you walk on, and what's the perfect headset, and what's the perfect speakers and things like that, to where we'll eventually have it to where it's like the movie theaters that people have in their homes and things like that. Totally. They just have to figure out the right perfect equipment set and layout.
Yeah, I mean, Ready Player One. Have you read that book?
Oh yeah. A little movie that might be coming out. So. Not that we're promoting that.
No, not at all. I listened to the audiobook, but it sounds really kind of cumbersome, with like all that he has to wear in that book. He has to. If you've never read it, you go see the movie, I guess, but he has to have a helmet and he has to have all this haptic stuff on, like a suit, and he's kind of got to be in a specific chamber, I think, for it to all hook in okay. And then it's, of course, very realistic for him.
Yeah.
But I would hope that there would be, it might get to that point, but then I would hope it'd go beyond that, where it'd be much more accessible and not so. Because one part, too, as a developer, we always are in and out of the headset constantly, and I don't know, maybe as a girl or not, or someone who likes their hair, I don't know. It's just, on again, off again, and by the end of the day, you're just a frazzled mess, and you're like, yeah.
I think he actually shaved his head for that.
Oh, really?
I think when he was getting into the suit and everything, he finally got rid of it. It was just like, I'm just going to shave my head off.
Yeah,
it's just... put this suit on all the time.
Like a swimmer, just to be streamlined for it all. So that's kind of, it would be nice if it got to a place where, I don't know, it was a little less cumbersome.
Yeah.
It was a little more modernized, streamlined, or whatever.
I thought it was interesting to continue on with that book, but I thought it was interesting that they had a little bit of the idea of parody within that as well. So he kind of progresses a little bit to where he starts off with, he can get into the same VR MMO world per se, with kind of the low tech that's just issued through schools and stuff like that. Basically the low level stuff. He still had enough immersion in that he could go into the VR world, but then later on he got basically what you're talking about, which is the VR room where he has all of his stuff and he just plugs into the Oasis and he goes from there. So it is interesting if we'll get to that level of where there's enough parity within the system that even like a preschooler can jump in and do VR things because it's provided by the education system. I mean, it's a comparison like iPads. I mean, that was just within recent years that has become like every school checks out iPads now. I mean, kids get them as just part of their resources.
It's a kind of a staple now, really, if and they have all the video game tech they're kind of incorporating into school systems. Minecraft is a huge learning one now, and so I didn't even think of that, but VR as a method for learning, like, hey, everybody, class, put your headsets on. Yeah. We're going to go back to Rome in the ancient times, and we're going to see what's going on.
It's great to be a kid.
I know, right? Because that would be amazing to just actually, because, words and diagrams and sometimes film can help, but to be there and see exactly, have the teacher kind of maybe float around and point to things.
Oh, yeah. Just a shared experience where we're just all teleported to a new location.
Yeah, that'd be... I don't know, just next level, for sure. For sure. But yeah, so anything that's a little less... I remember reading or listening to the audiobook from Ready Player One and thinking like, oh man, because he was, at one point he's sort of incognito without spoiling anything. And I remember thinking like, man, he's got to have a lot of stuff in order to get this to work. Yeah. And so, for it to just be a simpler process. Yeah. To sum all that up. But, well, any other video clips or anything that we missed out on that we want to share?
I think, I think we kind of went through everything. I'm just kind of letting things run right now.
Yeah, for sure.
The only other one I kind of thought of on here was kind of looking at the Star Trek one, and this is kind of segue from what we were just talking about with the shared experience. I can't really think of any other VR game. I'm sure there are ones out there and I'm just clueless to them, but have taken this approach of like, how do we all join in together and we're all sharing this game experience? I mean, and this is that perfect example of like education and how that ties with that, in that with it as well. But basically, so like if your teacher is not to kind of run off with the enterprise thing, if your teacher is basically the commander, we're taking a magic school bus sort of tour, and kids get to jump at different stations on there and explore dinosaurs or travel overseas to somewhere they've never been before. But VR would be that perfect sort of example of where we're all in that shared experience and we're all interacting with it, and it's not just playing a video or playing an edutainment sort of game by ourselves. We're joining in and sharing it with our teacher and with our classmates.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just kind of working toward a similar goal in a way. I mean, esports and everything like that, of course, is gaining so much traction as a recognized sport industry. Yeah. And this could easily be kind of in that category, VR esports, of like, hey, I'm a pro captain of the bridge, and that's my thing, and I play that position as on a sports team, and we compete and we win the Star Trek Super Bowl VR.
It is very interesting to kind of think of the idea of collaborative versus a single player sort of competing sort of thing. And we see that in esports right now, especially like League of Legends and stuff like that, where you have roles on a team and you're all joining in with that. But right now, VR is such a single player feeling because once you put that headset on, it's you immersed in the world, but not necessarily with your friends. And Star Trek is that kind of example of like, how do we get to more of this collaborative sort of thing, this idea of I taking on a role or I'm part of a team and I contribute to that. So that's very interesting to see where that kind of heads to with VR and how we can kind of solve any of the networking issues and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. We have a comment from me, Jack Burton, who I think is Sully, who said, have either of you read Snow Crash? It's another earlier take on the VR future from the chief futurist of Magic Leap.
Is that one, I'm failing on the author on that one, but I've read other things by, it's not Philip K. Dick, but it's I'm clueless on the author.
Neil Stephenson?
Neil Stephenson, yes, thank you.
Swooped in with Google.
I have read Snow Crash, and yeah, I agree. It is that sort of idea of that same sort of VR experience and the future of that sort of thing. It's futurism is one of those things where I don't think we can ever truly figure out or determine how things are actually going to play out in the future. I always use this as a good example of I don't think we ever knew that Big Brother was going to be Google and have all of our accounts tied into one thing, and it would be okay that happened.
That we would be all chill about
it.
Yeah,
there's no problem. Big Brother manages all my accounts and tells me what to do, and I'm fine with that.
I hope Big Brother makes more things that I can tie my account into and do more later. And also, Jack Burton, a.k.a. Sully, also said that the germs of sharing headsets could be a problem. And that's something, too. We take headsets and equipment to conventions and stuff all the time, and just having to, like, take it off and then pass it to the next person. Yeah. It's just, it can be pretty grody, too.
Yeah, and I guess that's another issue to solve. I've seen some solutions from the most recent CES show that was face diapers, just putting on these pads on your face and then putting the VR headset on top. I don't know if that's the correct solution, but
I always feel guilty because I get makeup all over my headsets, so whenever I just slap it on my face, I pull it off, and there's like an impression of where my face was. Okay, well, not the best way to treat our nice equipment.
Once again, it's that futurism thing. How do we solve that? And maybe in the future, VR are no longer headsets, but an implant or a contact lens we just put in our eyes, and then we're ready to go.
Right. I thought of Google Glasses, but those didn't do too well recently.
That's an example of a technology, and kind of like Kinect, I mean, as well, to where it was targeted towards one thing, and it didn't quite work out that way. Like, it didn't go the way they wanted to, but then there's still a kind of a sub technology level where it's still being used. So there's definitely applications for Google Glass, just not what they originally intended for. I guess it's one of those, like Kinect had the same sort of thing, to where we really intended it to be games and playing games and having that experience, but that didn't quite work out. But instead, we have a lot of great educational installations or projects that are based off of that same sort of data analysis that Kinect cameras give.
Do you think that if, I don't know, the Kinect had another life, a little bit better tech of tracking, and it was a little bit more precise, do you think it would do better if it was like released in several years from now or something?
So I think what it did was it basically opened up the idea of being able to draw those point maps, which now leads into technologies like AR and things like that. But it opened up that element of where maybe it doesn't have an existence in the hardware that passes forward and goes forwards with things. But it basically opened up that path for other technologies to pick up from and run with. And so, I mean, that's a kind of another example of where the Kinect sensor may not be the thing that carried forward and maybe just doesn't have a lifespan, but it opened up the path for other technologies to step in and start taking over that and pushing that tech forward.
Definitely. Because we had motion controller now actually being immersed inside of, a tracking system, but, we're still using the cameras essentially that were put in to track you for motion sensor stuff.
And that may be the example like VR as well. Like the idea and the tech for VR isn't brand new. Like it's something that's been worked on and been understood for a very long time. We just now have a good application for it, but maybe that pushes the idea of like now we need to solve the case of how do we get these things on our face and share this without sharing disease and other elements. We still want to have this tech. We want to push it forward, but how do we fix those issues that we have with it? And also the idea of taking the player out of their space and having them stumble around even though they're immersed in the world.
And be a little bit more, I guess, accessible to the average consumer. The Wii did so well because it was family friendly and anybody could kind of grasp like, oh, bowling or tennis, I understand. And then they would just instinctively do things like that. But we still have, QA testers that come in and they, first time in VR really get kind of overwhelmed or a little lost at times. Just because it can be really intimidating. You're just in a new world all of a sudden having to navigate.
And that is a very interesting thing. I mean, for the technology to move forward, it has to get to the level of other technologies that basically bewildered original users, like the TV, even before the TV movies, to where suddenly we're seeing motion on a screen that we're just not used to, and people were terrified of it and running away from the train that was coming at them and things like that. So I don't know if that's necessarily just it's definitely not a change in evolution of the actual person, but an acceptance of that technology and realizing that it's just part of your life and adjusting yourself because of that. So that may be what happens with the motion control thing of just getting more people involved in it, and it becomes an everyday thing that you're doing. Then we start kind of getting over these issues of motion sickness and other things like that. But of course, it could be a lot deeper than that. I am not a medical professional, so that may not be the solution for motion sickness.
Our best educated guess there.
Yes.
And having a generation kind of grow up with VR is something that is just kind of casual. Will be interesting to see too. We have a couple, younger kids of coworkers that will come in on holiday break, and then they'll play maybe a game or two while they're just hanging out around the office. And it's kind of fun to see how quickly they pick it up and how it doesn't really bug them as much being in VR. They kind of immediately put it on and they're kind of geared to go. They know, like, game, I got it.
Yeah.
So, sort of like a, AR experience or something. I can do this, no problem.
I think until we get to that level of where it's so immersed in the culture that we just don't have those issues, or we just don't see those issues with the people using that technology. I think until then, that still kind of ties back into design considerations, though, kind of bring this back around to game design, which is we have to keep those limitations within our realm of the design. So, I mean, to bring it all together, the designing for VR is working within the box and the constraints that you have. Yes, it is that freedom of now we have the player totally immersed in the game and things like that, but we still, as designers, have to be cautious to know that this isn't every user, and how do we still accommodate for a wide base of users, but then keep in consideration things like motion sickness, and even in regular video game design on the computer, things like color blindness and things like that as well. That's critical for designers to keep that in mind.
That's true. And like you mentioned earlier, just like always, if you have to teleport, making it have a reason in the world for having to teleport. Manifest 99, we tried to do that with looking into the crow's eyes. If you've ever played that, that's how you teleport. That was sort of our solve for that. It had a narrative purpose. And then with Island Time, hey, you're constrained to an area. Why? Because you're on an island. So just trying to attempt to give a bit of reason to it, because otherwise, if you're supposed to walk from A to B, it can seem a little jarring.
Yeah, I mean, Manifest was a great example of how to use that sort of idea of moving the player around and giving context to the teleportation. It wasn't the true, like, I look and figure out my teleport. It was I was moving between these crows and bodies, which that tied me more into the context of the game. And once again, it was amazing to be in a small bird, basically floating in the air. I could look down and say, whoa, I am standing on luggage. I am a bird. Yeah. And I felt involved in the world and part of it, even though all you did was just basically change my perspective within the world. But it's amazing how much of that you can pull off without even thinking you're going to affect the player that way.
Definitely, yeah. Just even shrinking you down, you feel that scale all of a sudden, and you wouldn't necessarily think, someone would get that right away. Well, no more questions for now, so we're kind of about 5 minutes out from wrapping up, but if you want to chat some more
this
about
is your
anything.
time. Send in questions.
Right.
Ask me things.
But any other final thoughts, I guess?
Let's do a 5-minute game design.
5-minute game design.
5-minute game design.
Oh,
Challenge
yes.
is we're going to design a VR game, and I got to put a theme on it. Collaborative based. So one person is in the headset, and another person is sitting and watching the player, but they get 2 different views. So the person in the headset sees something totally different than the person who's watching the TV screen.
Oh no! I was gonna say dodgeball. Now that you said that, I don't have
something
anymore. Can we?
That could still work.
It could. Okay.
That could still work. Okay. Let's go with this. So we got dodgeball.
Jack Bearden says, A.K. Sully says, including mimes in our game. So another layer we got to add to this.
Mimes. Okay. So you can't talk to each other. Okay. I'm going with this.
Okay.
Still collaborative based.
All right.
So you can't. Dodgeball works,
but
you still have to be competing against somebody.
Okay.
So what does the person that's in the headset do versus the person that has the controller?
Oh, gosh.
But they got to be working as a team, and they can't talk to each other.
As a team. Well, now I'm switching over to, like, laser tag rather than dodgeball.
Okay. Well, that still works, too, but you still have to be collaborative. So what's
true.
The different experience on those?
The only thing I can think of is that one person is actually in, like, some sort of maze, and he's hunting someone else. Then the partner is maybe their, I don't know, their, like, tech guy, whatever, or eyes on the situation.
Okay, so they can't talk to each other. So I'm going to flip it a little bit to where let's put our VR person as the kind of director. The person that's in the maze is the guy using the controller and watching the TV screen, so he can move around, but he needs direction.
Okay.
So now maybe the VR person is doing like hand signals or something like that, and so that kind of ties in and keeps you within the VR experience of I'm doing something active in my environment, I'm seeing things, but now my other player has to watch my character give him the hand signals of like, go this way, turn left, turn right.
And he looks like a mime,
Yeah, he looks like a mime. See, look at that.
There we go.
5-minute game design. We did it.
Ship it. We got it. Perfect. And we'll circle back on the dodgeball one. I feel like there was something there.
We had something.
Yeah, there was something. $14.99, that's all I suggest. That's great. Perfect price. We love that price. But, all right. I guess we'll sign off real fast. I got a little outro.
Okay, cool.
Any last things from you?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay, all right. Pulling up my outro real fast.
You want me to switch back over?
Oh, yeah. Well, either way. Oh,
okay.
Well, yeah, I can read over this.
Okay.
Yeah, we're all good. All right, so if you want to stay up to date with what we're doing at Flight School, follow us on Twitter at Flight School HQ or Facebook at facebook.com/Flight School Studio. We also have an email newsletter. You can sign up for it at islandtimevr.com. So we'll be back in, I think, 2 weeks, maybe a week, with just some more fun. So please come back, tune in again.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.